Germany's final weeks were defined by a brutal contradiction. The regime demanded total obedience at the exact moment its command system was disintegrating. Hitler issued orders for demolition, for counterattacks that could not be assembled, for a capital to be defended without the fuel, ammunition, or formations to defend it. And the men closest to him, Nazi ministers, OKW officers, field commanders, did not respond with a single unified belief or doubt. They responded with a spectrum of behaviors that can be tracked in documents, compliance that became performative, obedience that turned into delay, and, in a few cases, outright non-implementation that signaled the end of Hitler's authority as a functioning instrument of war. Before we go deeper into how Hitler's final decisions collapsed from commands into paper, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. By early 1945, Germany's war was no longer a matter of operational reach. It was material exhaustion and geographic compression. In the east, Soviet forces were already on the Oder by late January. In the west, Allied armies were breaking the last defensive lines and forcing crossings that made Germany's interior a battlefield. Berlin, a city of heavy rail hubs, power stations, and administrative ministries, became both a target and a symbol. Yet symbol did not replace logistics. Every day the Reich burned fuel it could not refine, fired shells it could not replace, and moved divisions that were no longer divisions in any modern sense. Collections of depleted battalions, improvised Volkssturm units, and fragments of armored formations without spare parts. Hitler's final decisions were not random. They followed a rigid internal logic. If the Reich could not win, the Reich should not survive intact. That logic became explicit on March 19, 1945, with the decree officially titled Destruction Measures Within Reich Territory, later widely known as the Nero Decree. It ordered the destruction of traffic, communications, industrial and supply installations that might be used by the enemy. Railroads, bridges, factories, utilities, everything that made post-war recovery possible, was treated as a weapon to be denied to the victors. This is where the question of what Nazi officers thought becomes measurable. Thought becomes action. The decree existed. The system to execute it was named military commands, Gauleiters, Reich Defense Commissioners. Yet the decree also revealed a new reality. Hitler could still sign orders, but he could not guarantee they would be carried out. The National W. Museum's analysis of this period describes the non-implementation of the scorched earth order as an early visible sign that Hitler's authority was beginning to wane, his writ no longer running in the collapsing machinery of state. Albert Speer's role mattered here not because it redeemed him. He was deeply implicated in the exploitation of forced labor and the war economy, but because his actions demonstrate that inside the regime's highest levels, some officials recognized that Hitler's final commands were no longer war measures. They were preparations for national ruin. Speer intervened, maneuvered for control of implementation, and obstructed the order's full execution. In practical terms, this meant the machinery of the Reich began to split, the Führer issuing destructive imperatives, and key administrators and commanders quietly shaping outcomes toward survival, not victory. While that was happening inside the ministries and command posts, the front that would decide Berlin was already forming east of the city. The German account, compiled as "The German Defense of Berlin," is explicit. There was no cohesive overall plan for Berlin's defense, only Hitler's determination to defend the capital, and a mass of improvisations shaped by chaos and catastrophic shortages of manpower and material. That is the environment in which officers' opinions became operational facts. A functioning high command can afford debate. A collapsing one is reduced to execution failures, fractured communications, and orders that arrive too late to matter. In that German study, Hitler is described as an advocate of stubborn defense, particularly of cities, and it notes his repeated belief that holding ground, often irrationally, could shift political outcomes, especially if the Western Allies and the Soviet Union might fracture into open conflict before Germany's final collapse. This mattered because it shaped the last sequence of decisions: hold Berlin, demand relief attacks, forbid surrender, and measure loyalty not by results, but by compliance. But inside the senior command structure, there were officers who saw the problem in purely military terms. General Oberst Gotthard Heinrici, commanding Army Group Vistula, is described in the same document as having a clear plan: avoid a battle for Berlin, protect civilians as much as possible, and move forces toward areas overrun by Western allies to spare soldiers from Soviet captivity. This was not ideology. It was a cold assessment of what captivity meant and what was still possible. His viewpoint collided with Hitler's, and the collision produced a pattern repeated across the final weeks. Hitler issued orders for attacks and holds. Commanders assessed them as impossible. Then they either tried to comply with partial measures or redirected forces for survival. The document describes how Heinrici believed the ordered relief attack toward Berlin had absolutely no prospect of success, and that concentrating forces, as Hitler demanded, would lead to the destruction of remaining formations. In the end, that divergence contributed to a direct clash with Field Marshal Keitel, and Heinrici was relieved on April 29th. That is not a rumor or a dramatic reconstruction. It is presented as part of the command breakdown in the German historical report. By mid to late April, Berlin's fate was no longer a strategic question. It was a map, shrinking under artillery. Soviet forces began their large-scale offensive on April 16th. Within days, the Oder and Neisse fronts collapsed. By April 21st, Soviet forces reached the outskirts and key points around Berlin. On April 23rd, according to the chronology in the German defense study, the OKH and OKW left Berlin, while Hitler ordered the 12th Army to attack toward Berlin from the west. This order would become one of the clearest examples of final decisions turning into operational fantasies, because the physical conditions to execute them no longer existed in the required time and space. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere became that of a frontline command post, described with the plain details that make it real: maps spread on tables, communications failing, officers arriving covered in mud, reports delivered with narrowing time horizons measured in hours. The U.S. National Archives blog on the Hunting Hitler series captures this collapse in communications. By April 29th, communications with the outside world were all but broken, and those inside the bunker increasingly did not know what was happening on the fronts. The bunker did not merely hide Hitler, it isolated command from reality at the moment reality required constant, accurate signal flow. That breakdown is critical to the question of what Nazi officers thought. In a modern command structure, officers think through reports. In the bunker, reports stopped. On April 29th, General Alfred Jodl was able to send a message that OKW knew nothing about 9th Army, believed Wenck's 12th Army was near Potsdam, and could only report a hasty withdrawal westward by Army Group Vistula. That is not just confusion. It is the functional death of operational awareness. As the circle tightened, Hitler's decisions became less about maneuver and more about posture, forbidding surrender, demanding that Berlin be held, ordering relief attacks that could not be coordinated, and treating the act of ordering as if it were equivalent to action. The German defense study notes that by the end, Hitler's estimates of his means and the enemy's strength were wholly unrealistic, while also stating he was not medically insane and maintained command authority to the very end. That distinction matters. The collapse wasn't caused by inability to sign orders. It was caused by the gap between paper authority and physical capability. In late April, senior figures around Hitler were also fracturing politically. In his message to Keitel, carried out of the bunker by Nicholas von Below, Hitler stated that he had appointed Karl Dönitz as successor and that Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler had betrayed him. This is not a later invention. It appears in the National Archives account of April 29th, movements and documents leaving the bunker. The regime's internal logic had reached its endpoint. Loyalty was collapsing, and Hitler's last decisions were being written into orders of succession and accusations of treason, even as the city around him was being physically dismantled by artillery and fire. If you want visual context for how small and engineered that last command space really was, here are period bunker layout diagrams that can be used as on-screen reference: Reich Chancellery, Führer bunker plan, and Vorbunker plan. These images help convey why, as communications failed, the war compressed into a few rooms and a few map tables. Outside those rooms, the last German decisions produced measurable consequences. The same German defense account emphasizes that Hitler refused urgent requests to withdraw Ninth Army from the Oder in time. The result was not heroic defense, but encirclement risk and a collapsing perimeter. Only very late were troops ordered into Berlin, and by then, Soviet penetrations made coherent perimeter defense impossible. Inside the bunker on April 29th, SS Brigadeführer Wilhelm Mohnke laid out the tactical reality on a map of central Berlin, Soviet proximity measured in blocks and bridges, and assessed the remaining time in hours, not days. That kind of reporting shows what officers thought in the only form that mattered. They framed the situation as finite and closing. And then, even within that doomed perimeter, the officer corps' response was not a single emotion. Some continued to perform loyalty. Some tried to salvage lives through breakout authorization. The archives account describes General Helmuth Weidling arriving covered in mud, stating the situation was hopeless and suggesting a breakout. Hitler rejected surrender, but ultimately agreed to break out in small groups while continuing resistance where possible. That is the final shape of Nazi command thinking in Berlin: not surrender, not victory. Fragmentation into survival attempts under the continuing prohibition of capitulation. When people ask what Nazi officers thought of Hitler's final decisions, the answer is not found in imagined conversations. It is found in the paper trail and the implementation record. The Nero Decree shows an order designed to destroy Germany's infrastructure was issued at the top, while senior administrators maneuvered to obstruct its execution. The German defense report shows commanders like Heinrici assessed Berlin's defense as a catastrophe to be avoided, and that this viewpoint could not prevail because command authority remained centralized around Hitler until it was too late. The bunker record shows operational awareness failing, relief attacks becoming wishful constructs, and breakout discussions replacing any coherent battle plan. The final act was written not only in battlefield orders, but in the legal language of regime continuity. Hitler's will and political testament were prepared and carried out of Berlin by couriers on April 29th, while the bunker waited for the end. The U.S. National Archives' published discussion of Hitler's last will emphasizes how these documents were created and moved under collapsing conditions, a final administrative gesture inside a state that had already lost control of the world outside its walls. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.